Here we are. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Hello to NASFiC audience. This is a panel. This is a panel called Steampunk Lessons for a Post-Fossil Fuel Future. If you think you're somewhere else, you are not. Let me read the description, then I'm going to go around and have our panelists introduce themselves. And people who are running things behind the scenes, I don't see Q&A, and I'd like to be able to just let me know what's up with that while I perform introductions. And I'm going to start up in the corner with Phoebe Barton. Phoebe, will you introduce yourselves to our esteemed audience?
Sure. Hi, I'm Phoebe Barton. I'm a queer trans science fiction writer. I've had stories in analog. I have one coming up in Lightspeed. I've been in Kaleidotrope and multiple anthologies. And I'm also working on a book that takes place on a world that has no fossil fuels. So this is a topic that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of what is possible and what is not, given these limitations.
Awesome. All right. I am going to turn to Jim Beal. Jim, tell us who you are.
My name is Jim Bell.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I'm a professional engineer, worked in the energy field for closer to 50 years than I'd like to admit. I'm pretty much retired now. I have spent most of my career in nuclear. And unlike many of the other panelists who have written a lot of fiction, I have my name on a lot of documents out there as well, but I tried my best to make them nonfiction. And since most of them are nuclear safety reports and inspection reports and analyses, that's probably for a good thing.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I highly approve, although all right. I'm going to refrain from speculating on the state of the world. Eileen, will you introduce yourself?
Bully. I'm Eileen Gunn. I write short stories. There isn't a lot to say. I've won the Nebula. I've been nominated for the Hugo a few times. And I write short stories. I have a fairly short attention span. And I also am mostly, I write while blocked. Basically, I'm always blocked. And it's eventually, I realize that's just my state of writing. So I'm a slow writer. Thanks to Kat, I've been writing a lot more since the virus hit. Kat has done more for writers than I think anybody can even say in this pandemic.
Well, it's somewhat self-serving. I run co-writing because everybody keeps me honest and writing too. So that's been really nice. In fact, Eileen, the first time we were ever on a panel together, it was in fact a panel on writer's block. And I remember you talking about writing in the state of block. So, Bill Higgins, will you introduce yourself?
Hello, Bill Higgins. I am a physicist doing radiation safety at Fermilab, the particle accelerator not far from Chicago. And while I have smashed a few atoms in my time, and there are a number of neutrinos with my name on them, several dozen light years from here, I have mostly been doing safety paperwork and studies and kind of the sorts of things Jim was talking about, but for accelerators in recent years. I'm pretty interested in the history of science, and that has sometimes brought me in contact with steampunk related themes, which, maybe we'll get to eventually.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. I'm Kat Rambo. Mainly I'm coming to this panel as somebody who sometimes dabbles in steampunk writing. And I also teach a class on writing steampunk and another called All the Punks, talking about just sort of the punk part of everything. And that's one of the things I'm curious about. So I'm going to read you the description of this panel, and I'm going to go around and have folks talk about what they thought when they first hit it. But while I'm doing that, folks in the audience, I would love for you to start asking some questions that you've come to this panel with, because we're going to shape our presentation around that. So if there are reasons you're here, if there are things that you want us to be talking about, now's a really good time to be asking us. And so the description of the panel is, and I have to read the first part because it kind of cracks me up. Join our delightful and multi-generational panel as they discuss what lessons can be learned from steampunk and old technology. What books or screen stories would you take with you to learn how to thrive in a deindustrialized world? What can be applied from steampunk when writing fiction set in the post-fossil fuel age? Let me stick that there in the, I don't know if is that in the chat? I don't know if that's visible to everyone or not, but it's visible to our panelists. So Eileen, you foolishly made the mistake of nodding sagely. So I'm going to start with you.
I was wondering if I could find my email that I sent to you when I read the title of the panel. And I said something on the order of, I think we could think of ourselves as a multi-generational starship moving through steampunk for aeons and breeding happily as we go. So my first reaction, as I told Kat, was, oh my God, they know how old I am.
So how about the steampunk part though? What did you think when you hit, when you were like, I'm going to prepare for this panel?
Well, I thought, the steampunk that I prepared for, it was writing the Difference Dictionary as a review of the Difference Engine, the novel by Sterling and Gibson. And I read that and I thought, nobody is going to even get their jokes. And and anyone who is a history major is going to be filled with alternate history, alternate US, alternate England, alternate Japan, and they will never get it straight again. They will have to take exams and they will be lost, totally lost as history majors. I was a history major, so I felt kind of sympathetic towards these poor graduate students. So I went out and researched everything in the book. I researched a lot of stuff that I thought the weirdest stuff is probably true, knowing Gibson and knowing Sterling. So I have an Encyclopedia Britannica, 1912 edition, 1912 edition. And I went to that and found a lot of stuff in it because that's right about their sweet spot. It's about the 19th century, middle 19th century, which is where the Britannica came from. So that just researching steampunk material basically is my claim to fame, and writing about it. My essay became part of the Japanese edition of the Difference Engine.
Oh, how cool. That's really neat. All right. Jim Bell, what sprang to mind? I believe you've come with slides to show.
I didn't know exactly where to start with this because I don't write steampunk. But so I came at it from the point of view is, what energy would be available? What could you harness to be able to have a good lifestyle? And because the more people you have, or the better your lifestyle you want it to be, the more you're going to have to make things. So what power sources are there? And before electricity, before we were able to burn fossil fuels in great quantities and for industrial purposes, there were other means of power. There was wind and there's water and others as well. But in order to have a small scale, all you need is cottage industry. If you want larger scale, you need craft level of energy and industry. But if you want something more than that, you have to have industrial size production facilities. And I have a couple slides of some pre-electrical factories that were done. And if I could have one of them right now, that would be helpful. Okay, what you're seeing here is a machine shop, I believe, if I have it. I can't see the full size picture. And you can see all the belts coming down. What they have is a prime mover somewhere that's driving long shafts. And each of these long shafts has pulleys. They have multiple belts on it. I think you're looking at a Victorian machine shop there. The other one is another image, if I could have the second one. Now, these are other pictures of the same sort of facility. And you can see that is how they build things. Now, if you're a lady and you're wearing long clothes, that is an OSHA disaster right there looking at it, because you're going to get caught on any of those belts. But that is what you needed, but you still needed a prime mover to do all that. Okay, that's all I need for that. So I don't need the slides anymore. So what I was showing there is that you were able to do industrial level manufacturing without electricity and without really sophisticated applications of power, but it was hard. It was a lot of work and it was dangerous. And you still couldn't support this kind of society we have today. So what sources would you want? What could you use? So that's how I came at it.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to go to Phoebe.
All right. Well, what I was thinking about was honestly more in terms of the technological perspective, similar to Jim, because I feel like that's a lot of what steampunk has come to symbolize, like an alternate technological path, rather than it's more of the steam than the punk. But it does also really depend on what sort of thing you're looking at, in terms of where you're starting from. Are you looking at like an alternate timeline that went whole or hog on that sort of technology? Or are you looking at like a transformed technological base, or something that's post the collapse of an industrial infrastructure? Those all give you very different answers. But I feel like one important thing, I guess, that I get in terms of just the general stereotype of that sort of technology is reliability, because you have so much of the idea of these being like essentially big solid metal pieces that don't have to be built with super sophisticated modern equipment, and can have replacement parts reliably made. Like the difference between like a refrigerator made in the 30s or the 50s and one made today, because like I know there are technologies like made in the like individual items made in the 30s or 40s still working today, but I highly doubt that a fridge built today would still be running in 2090 because of the differing philosophies. And so much of it is just the philosophy of what is important in terms of how is this industrial society being maintained with this equipment.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Bill, how about you?
I thought a panel with the word steampunk in it, I thought I knew, I have some thoughts about steampunk, some experience with it, I've read some of it, and but the panel description takes a turn, right, where it says what lessons can we learn from that kind of fiction that we take with us into this post fossil fuel future. So it's asking us to think about one kind of story that we're fairly familiar with in terms of a really different kind of story that doesn't have really obvious connections to Jules Verne or the Difference engine. And the more I thought about it, what does it say? To learn how to thrive in a deindustrialized world, which deindustrialized and post fossil fuel don't necessarily. Well, one is not necessarily imply the other, right? They're kind of independent concepts, and you could write stories where both are true or either one is true. But the other thing is that seems to be the opposite of steampunk to me, in the sense that that steampunk is building on Jules Verne and the marvelous inventions kinds of stories of the 19th century, that dime novels and such, or even maybe Frankenstein taking. There's lots of stories about making an artificial being, but Mary Shelley in Frankenstein made a scientist be the person that cooks up the artificial being. It's not magic. It's not intervention of the gods, right? Okay, so that's what makes Frankenstein science fiction, and all of this stuff. It seems to me that what we're getting at when we think about the 19th century and telling stories about the wonders and marvels of that era is kind of it's industrialization is new. Science is discovering new things. We're building new kinds of vehicles that, like steamships, that go to new places. We have electricity powering a bunch of stuff. We can imagine electricity powering even more stuff. Near the end of the century, people start to get oil out of the ground. And this not only is clearly changing the face of society over the century, but it causes people to imagine new kinds of stories and that new technologies, which in turn make possible adventures, or in our more sophisticated era, make us take the look through a social lens at the changes that might happen in society, or the sorts of things that our modern science fiction is concerned with, moved backwards into the steampunk alternate history or historical era. Okay, well, confronting a rising industrialization and rising high technology doesn't seem to be the same thing as, wow, we've been dependent for a couple hundred years on fossil fuels, and now we're trying to build a civilization that doesn't use them. Maybe, I think it's probably the novelty and the ingenuity and the imagination of technologies taking a brand new turn, or imagining ways that you could just give up technologies that we've all taken for granted for so long. Maybe that's that kind of pioneering, or that kind of frontier, is the frontier of the kind of fiction the panel description is talking about. So I'm winding down now.
Well, this is super interesting to me, partially because Phoebe mentioned with steampunk, often it's more the steam than the punk. And I think that steampunk in many ways has become somewhat bankrupt in terms of it's an Xbox skin, it's particular look, it's jewelry with little gears on it. And at the same time, there's other punk speculative movements like solar punk and nanopunk that to me have preserved more of the punky part, which is about the sort of anti-corporate, community, rather individual, sort of a different set of values, perhaps, which I think is kind of where you're going, Bill, in that direction. I'm looking at the questions in the chat, which are a fascinating array. So let's start with this first one. What alternate steampunk technologies should we be developing now in order to have them when we need them? And I certainly would say all the renewable stuff like wind and solar, geothermal, and all of that. What else would you guys add?
Well, I would say it's kind of not necessarily strictly steampunk, but it is also the sort of thing I wouldn't be surprised at all to show up in that sort of setting. Room temperature superconductors.
Ooh, yeah.
Okay. Which would make renewables far more effective because they can be placed where the generation capacity is strongest and not lose so much of their generation as heat while transmitted.
Awesome. Okay. Eileen, did you have something you wanted to?
Well, I was just oohing and eyeing at what Phoebe said, but I think of steampunk as being essentially a fantasy rather than science fiction. But a lot of it is about the kind of the lure of science and the lure of technology. And most of the technologies are made up. I mean, Gibson and Sterling had this huge rosewood computer system with clacking and, just mechanical computers and punch card cinema and stuff like that. And their book was primarily about just glorifying in what you could, sort of the human imagination and how humans could imagine different kinds of sciences and stuff. So, and technologies, basically. What I came up with in that sort of subgenre is bioluminescent lights. Now, if people really kind of put their minds behind it and bred competitively for luminescence in certain bioluminescent plants or creatures, we could have our octopus lights and our lichen street lights and stuff like that. And I thought in the sense of it actually doing it, no, but in the sense of it making a great, throwaway line in a steampunk novel, bioluminescent street lights, sure. Octopus lights, yeah.
Love the idea of octopus. Jim or Bill, did you want to add to that at all?
Well, I would make a distinction here. The human imagination is not limited by manufacturing technology. So
exactly.
if the imagination can come up with a device or a principle, then the question becomes, at the cottage level, you can build anything. You can build a gun, like Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. He could build guns in the days of knights in armor, but you couldn't only build a few, and you could not build very many, and they would not be as good as you would think. But you can build them. If you're having a society depending on the technology, you have to have the ability to produce. Now, one thing I would say in terms of steampunk technology is that the way to store energy is the way to look for a lot of answers. To look at the octopus light, for example, there are ways to have chemicals which can absorb light and then radiate it back again. Kind of like those chemical things you have kids that break at these nighttime get-togethers, and they glow for a while. There's no reason why you could not make a chemistry approach that would have that as glow globes that you could hang on your lines during the day, and during the night they'd be lights. There's no reason why you can't do that.
Yeah.
But how would you manufacture them? How would you store energy? Remember, technology is all about using stored energy for something. Would you use the stored energy, for example, in the hydropower to wrap springs, compress springs? A lot of these things are springs. How do you compress those springs? How do you store the energy? So if you can't store it in a fuel source, you have to store it in a chemical source, which can be a fuel source or a mechanical source. Or one of the other comments talks about solar panels. How do you make a solar panel? So some of these are chemical processes, and some of these are high energy industrial processes. When you can do one, you might not be able to do the other. Steampunk might find, how do we do it with the other?
Awesome. Bill, did you want to gloss anything on that before I move on?
Just that, as Jim is hinting, the energy has to come from somewhere. And in the case of the glow tubes that you're cracking, someone has mixed up chemicals that are basically a latent source of energy. If we have octopus lights and we keep feeding the octopus, then and keep the octopus in good health, then presumably we can get light out of the creature. But there'll come a time when you can't read anymore tonight because your octopus is tired. And it's not until tomorrow can you renew that that
Have two
story.
octopuses.
You have a
Yes,
reserve.
that would work. But then,
Backup.
if you're wealthy enough to be able to afford
Uh,
luminescent
Great.
octopi, then good for you. But not all of us can afford that.
You have to walk the octopi, right? You have to walk them. Don't you have to clean their lights out?
You
That's
have
right.
to take care of them however you're supposed to take care of them.
However, all right, I am going to move on to the next question, which I think is pretty goddamn serious, which is, are dirigibles or any other technology mandatory for steampunk? And anyone that wants to answer this, I'm going to say no on dirigibles. I think steam power is necessary for steampunk, but
Well, how are you going to get flight? How are you going to get flight? You need powered flight somehow.
So is it got to? Do we have to do dirigibles? Is that the only way in steam power?
There is a lot of power required to do anything else. If you get heavier than air machines, a lot of power, lots of power.
Yeah, I mean,
And
looking at the difficulties faced with electric aircraft just because of the massive batteries, and that's even now. So yeah, I would say like airships are not required for steampunk, but it's more just to agree with Jim, like they're really the only ones compatible with depending on your technology level, like it is possible to have heavier than aircraft in a post-fossil fuel society, but then you are looking at a lot of additional technologies to support that. So it's not that easy either.
Stored energy.
What energy?
Stored energy.
Stored energy.
Yeah, it does boil down, so to speak, to stored energy. But there's I would say dirigibles are. I take the question to be more of a stylistic question, like, shouldn't your story have some dirigibles in it if you really want it to be steampunk? And then, of course, that leads naturally in the charge to our panel. What is the role of lighter than aircraft in the future that we're trying to envision? And the great thing about lighter than aircraft is once you have made some lifting gas, you might not need to expend any extra energy to go from place to place because your thing you're not using powered lift. But one thing to say is that we had ballooning for sort of a century or more, and it got very sophisticated. But dirigibles, like powered craft that could go where you wanted them, really weren't very practical until internal combustion engines came along. And when that did happen, we had an age of zeppelins and blimps and other craft, but they're big and fat because they inherently need a lot of volume, just like a balloon does, to do their lifting. And that means that they have a lot of air resistance. And if you want to make them go anywhere with any speed, suddenly you're back to, we have to have some engines in this, like we have it in a heavier than aircraft. And the engines have to be working really hard to push my Zeppelin through the air with any great speed. And it turns out that their natural advantages over heavier than aircraft weren't really all that great an advantage. And the disadvantages by, say, 1937 had showed up that were pretty darn obvious, and people mostly quit using them, much to the chagrin of everyone who loves to see a blimp in the skies.
But that's the reason why dirigibles are essential in steampunk. Everyone loves to see a blimp in the sky. It doesn't have anything to do with the scientific reason, with the technology reason. It has to do with the emotional attachment of human beings to dirigibles.
Dirigibles are really the sign, in the stylistic sign in science fiction, not of the steampunk story, strictly speaking, but of the alternate history story. Dirigibles are something we regret not having much of in the timeline that we actually lived through. And in other timelines, we would love to have had better and more and better dirigibles. And that's
Can I pile
why
on?
Zeppelins equals alternate history.
Can I pile on here?
Yeah.
One of the very first civilian use of atomic reactors that I found proposed was a nuclear powered dirigible.
Oh,
Now, would you want a reactor floating over your head in a gas bag?
oh yes, yes.
With
It's a
atoms for
story
peace, why
element.
don't we build a peace dirigible? Well, I could think of a bunch of reasons.
It's awesome. This next question is specifically for Eileen, which is, what is the importance of the 1912 Britannica? Is it just that you happened to find 1912, or did you look specifically for the year 1912?
The actual Britannica that's important is the 1911 one. I
Ah,
happen to have the 1912 edition, but there is nothing that's been added to it except some kind of an index. It's the last version of the Encyclopedia Britannica that could actually cover everything that was going on in the world.
oh, good.
It's 24 volumes, I think. I found mine in a thrift store for $42, and I'd always wanted one, and my husband had wanted one, and we thought we were going to have to spend $400 for one. And I walked into a thrift store in Medford, Oregon, and there was like a golden light shining down on this box.
I believe it. I think it's online. At one time, it was online, and I
It is still
downloaded it.
online, yeah. It's just not terribly readable online because it's old code,
I
basically.
use it for
But
research
it's,
for
it's
World War
really a
One.
wonderful thing.
I use it
Sorry.
for World War I research.
Exactly.
Bill, what are you going to add?
I think that the 1911 edition is probably important in the history of the World Wide Web, because there are many editions of the Britannica that come before it, but that's the last major edition that wasn't covered by copyright at the time that the web arose,
Interesting.
so that you could have all that text for free if someone had scanned it in or otherwise prepared it for in computer readable way. And stuff like Wikipedia was built initially out of copyright reference sources as a kind of like beginning ingredient. And having a whole encyclopedia, even if it was most of 100 years old, online was really vital and useful for a lot of things when people were starting to make a global information source on, and the people that did it were doing it on very small budgets and they couldn't pay royalties to the Britannica people.
Well, and I will, to people that are writing steampunk or writing in these eras, go to Project Gutenberg, which has a ton of this stuff scanned in. It is a rabbit hole down which, if you vanish and don't come back, I'm sorry, not sorry. I'm going to go to the next question, which is actually a comment. Jeff is mentioning thinking about steampunk, and then also seeing a lot of folks living in RVs and tiny homes off the grid, using mostly solar energy and sometimes geothermal. And certainly I see the maker movement often tied into this. But then here's the question: what is the role of water power in a steampunk future? Wheels linked to shafts and belts, for example.
Well,
And go ahead.
Well, I would say for that, especially like whether or not you're going on an alternate track or like a future, like water is extremely important because it's a relatively, compared to a lot of other things, it's a relatively low technology needed method of generating a lot of power. That's like, it's one reason why Niagara Falls was such an industrial powerhouse around the late 19th and early 20th century, because you had all of the power of the falls accessible and tappable right there. Before, in an era when like there had not been, was not yet major developments in terms of like where the internal combustion engine was new, where where major coal power plants were still fairly new, I believe. I don't know exact timeframes on that, but in the absence of really in the absence of fossil fuels, like the only significant major baseload electricity providers are like you can have water, you can also have geothermal, but that is also very location dependent, and nuclear, but nuclear power has a very high technological barrier to entry.
Anyone want to add?
I could just add as a sort of historical note, I once wrote advertising for a DECSAT agency, Digital Equipment Corporation, who created the first mini computers, for instance. And they were in an old mill in Maynard, Massachusetts. And the mill wheel was still there. It was a textile mill, but I think that machine, those machine photos that Jim showed, are very much in tune with the origins of the computer industry, basically, or often in old mill stations and stuff like that, where water was terribly important to driving the technology of the time. So I learned a lot about the working conditions of people in the 19th century just from going to DEC.
I would add that the grid began when Edison first powered a switch that powered part of downtown New York from a generator that he named Jumbo after the elephant that was then in Times Square. And he could only generate power for about a half a mile around him because he was using DC and you had voltage drop off. Niagara Falls was useful not just because it was a central power source, but because Westinghouse and Tesla had gotten together along with another gentleman who invented the transformer. Without the transformer, you can't send power very far, because what transformer did is it allowed you to generate power at 100 volts, which is where it wants to be generated at, and then raise the voltage up to thousands and thousands of volts, send it down lines at very low losses, and then make it lower voltage again so you could use it in actual equipment. So when he powered the city of Albany from Niagara Falls, he needed not just the falls, he needed the transformer. And a transformer is not an invention you can make a whole lot of without some of the same power sources you're going to need. So they did because that's how they did it. But you get into one of those how do you get bootstrap scenarios. But a lot of the power systems we're talking about, unless you can do transmission, you are stuck in the location of the power source. Also, transportation in general is a problem that steampunk has to deal with. If you have water, you just don't use it for making power, which you will need to do. You also need it to get goods and services around cheaply, like we always did pre-industrial. Steampunk has got to solve the transportation problem if you're going to have large populations.
Well, it seems to me that if those people inventing hydroelectric power and trying to apply it and distribute it had Phoebe's superconducting, high temperature superconductors or some kind of superconductor, then it would change the face, or would change all of the equations, all of the design ideas of how you would where the electricity would go, how far away, what it would
I agree.
cost, and so forth.
I agree. The way to do it would be biology. Use those squids, for example. The squid
Use
fluid.
a squid.
Have a superconductor biofluid of some sort, chemical fluid. Doesn't mean we can't invent it. We just don't have invented it here.
I would like to point to future historians, when you come to squid punk, this is in fact the moment that the movement was invented.
Eileen, we'll call it the Eileen movement. She started it.
I want to actually kind of cherry pick a question because I love this question so much. How will the changing technologies support or undermine the power structures of society? And I think that's a super interesting question. Someone want to take a stab at that?
I'll say that I rather than offer any insight, I'll say that is a problem for the storyteller.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of possible answers to that question, and it depends on your imagination and what you think happens, how you think the world changes with the changing technologies, and what how the characters or the institutions in the society that they're a part of react to that. And there's a lot of ways it could go, and that's the business you people are in.
I think Jim might have some interesting perspective on this, because I think by decentralizing the power source, by making it cottage industry, you decentralize a lot of the dependence on a centralized government, and that could be used. Jim, do you have more to add?
I do. I mean, you could go a great many ways with this. For example, take the last Mad Max movie. Do you remember those two islands of technology? One guy had the water source he controlled, and the other guy had the oil source he controlled. And they became their own polities just because they had the unique power, because they had the only resource of that type, and they would trade with each other. So you would have the same potential of not being able to put together a large country, because again, you have to have transportation to have a large country, and you have to have various power sources of stored energy to have it a higher technology large country. So it would change everything dramatically. And the storyteller, I think Bill's right. It's up to the storyteller, because I'm just an engineer and you guys tell the story.
I want to throw something in here as well, which is that when we are talking about like kind of doing away with factories and stuff, we're talking about doing away with cheap goods for the masses. And some people are, to me, steampunk is in some ways a very white privileged movement in terms of economic means. And so I think that is a kind of uneasy thing that plays against this. I love, in many ways, the romantic notions of steampunk. I love the chains and the gears and the individualistic scientist, but I'm also very conscious that aesthetic is some ways a pushback against the Industrial Revolution, which does both good and bad things in terms of people overall. And so I am, to use a phrase, playing devil's advocate here, just to throw that out to say, what do you think of that?
I would say that I definitely agree, because that's the sort of thing what I was going towards when I said it's more steam than punk. Because to me, like, just how like in cyberpunk, a lot of the punk is represented by people, by the oppressed, using this technology to resist the power of the corporations that control that. It feels to me like the appropriate equivalence in steampunk would be the peoples oppressed by colonial empires of that era, using that technology as resistance. Like, it would basically making Captain Nemo strong steampunk figure in that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of it has gone towards the aesthetics, and rather than looking at that at those aspects of it. And it is definitely something to consider, especially in the context of a post-fossil fuel thing, because like colonial empires do not require fossil fuels in order to exist. Evidence history, but that sort of the accessibility of that sort of like that sort of power source makes it so much easier and so much more devastating.
Most colonial empires came about because one side had a technology edge.
Yeah. Oh, and canned food made a huge difference to the Civil War in terms of provisioning and stuff. It's really one of the things that's been really interesting to me. Jim, you mentioned this technology is about using stored energy to do something. And then Bill made the point about infrastructure and moving stuff around. And I think that is something we want to remember when we're writing these societies, is that you do need to think about the economics and the infrastructure and how this stuff works. With fantasy, it's not enough to just kind of go, oh, magic, right? And
No, you have to make the reader believe in your magic. And, fantasy these days has world building in it just as elaborate as a hard science fiction novel in many cases, in many of our best cases. And for the steampunk's part, when we're harking back to those great days of rivets and steam, and when the electricity and amazing scientific discoveries seem to be stuff you could tell stories about, we put ourselves smack in the era of global colonialism.
oh, yeah.
And actually, today's steampunk fiction often confronts that directly and says, wait a minute, okay, what about the brown people in a Jules Verne novel, right? There's all kinds of people with all kinds of perspectives in the world that I'm imagining, and maybe we're not just telling a story about the wealthy white people. Well, can we take a lesson from that to look forward into a new energy future? I think a lot of interesting futures will lie in more sophisticated manufacturing, higher technology, but freeing ourselves from these limited resources of the past that are clearly, messing up our atmosphere and whatnot. So that, cell phones and the internet have really transformed our world, and the kinds of innovations they give us can give us new worlds. So we're probably, or there's a lot of interesting possible futures where we are still manufacturing lightweight, low power consumption information technologies and other kinds of innovation, like, let's say, superconductors, that can make a greener future, but with higher levels of technology. And when I say that as a techno-optimist, you're going to think about the possible drawbacks of techno-optimism, and is the factory that makes the cell phones making something very dirty and dumping it out back, and who exactly is doing this manufacturing, and are there oppressed people back there, and so forth. We now know how to see the bigger picture, and then I guess the novelist takes a piece of the picture and paints it for the reader with an invitation that beyond the borders of the picture and outside the pages of the novel, there's a big complicated thing that the author understands that you're not seeing.
Awesome. Someone want to add to that eloquence in the last couple of minutes, or do we want to let that stand?
I wanted to refer
Go ahead.
to what Jim had been saying about the problem of extending any given technology to the people at large, because I think that is kind of the issue with romantic and glamorous little steampunky things. Is, so what are people using down in the valley? What are people using on the top of the hill? What's everybody in China doing? China, in many of the countries that had less technology in the 50s, can actually leapfrog ahead of Western countries that are heavily invested in infrastructure that is rapidly outdating. So new steampunk infrastructure in countries like that may catch on more quickly in this fictional world we're creating. And change the balance of power in any national interaction kind of level in the work involved in the novel. Jim?
Well, again, like I said before, you have different levels of manufacturing. You have craft, you have cottage, and you have mass. And you have the transportation problems, and you have stored energy problems. All of those have to be addressed by any author because that's how people are living. If you have a new invention or a new material or something new that you can add to the equation, then that makes things a lot easier. But I would note that the first urban planning conference I know of was in 1898 in Philadelphia. It was supposed to last a week. It broke up after 3 days because nobody could figure out how to solve the horse manure problem. Because there were 150,000 horses living in New York City that were depositing 22 pounds of manure each day per horse, 45,000 tons a month. They could not figure out how were they going to be able to get food in and the horse manure out. The city was doomed. What saved it? The automobile. By 1917, the last horse-drawn carriage made its run in New York City. So you need technology to solve these problems.
Yeah.
Invent it. You're the authors. Invent it for us.
Remember, technology isn't just dirigibles, it's about poop too, right?
Here's your renewable resource, Bill.
It really is. I see people are totally invited to come talk more about this in the Discord channel, but I see that we are out of time. Could I just very quickly ask people where our charming audience can find you next? Eileen, people that are looking for you, where can they see your charming face next?
Good Lord, I have no idea.
No
My last
idea.
story was last year in Isaac Asimov's.
Okay,
And my next story I just finished and I have no idea where it will go.
awesome. All right. Bill, for your fans that are joining the Bill Higgins fan club, where are they going to find you?
I'm on Twitter, I guess, as Mr. Beam Jockey. Mr. MR and then BEAM and JOCKEY, because when I got on Twitter, someone else had already taken Beam Jockey.
Oh, no.
So I'm Mr. Beam Jockey.
Okay, awesome. Phoebe, people that are looking for inimitable Phoebe Barton products, where are they going to find you or your stuff?
I am at a Phoebe Barton on Twitter.
Okay, awesome. And Jim Bell, where can we find you?
Probably nowhere. I mean, I'm just an engineer. I think my first nonfiction work is about to be anthologized by Bain in Homo Stellaris, People of the Stars. One of my short stories. Well, it's not a short story. It's a nonfiction article. The short story length. It's titled "Our World Ship Broke." The question is, how do you fix it?
Oh, awesome.
And I am on Twitter and I'm not completely deracinated from technology. I'm on Twitter and Facebook.
I am as well. You can find me on places usually as Cat Rambo, that being the advantage.
Facebook here as well.
There you go. Awesome. Farewell, my friends. Let us all pose as they get clicked and go into the internet. Now's the time to wave, make fun.
I'll just point at my hard hat.
There we go. Say goodbye.